A reading from the letter of Paul to the Romans. If it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died, and the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. Did what is good then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin, working death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now I do what I do not want. I agree that the law is good, but in fact it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. So then, with my mind, I am a slave to the law of God, but with my flesh, I am a slave to the law of sin. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Thanks be to God.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. Jesus said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." When Jesus had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And Jesus said, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of Christ.
Well, as I said at the opening of the service, we're going to continue on with the series that we have undertaken through the season of Easter, talking about how it is that Jesus might say to us today, 2,000 years later, what in our religious thinking might need to change. And the topic I want to talk about today is one that cannot be sufficiently addressed in a single sermon. This is not the first time you've heard me say that. So much of what it is that we explore in the scriptures, of course, are immense and huge and all of these things, and that's just the way it is. So I just want you to know, of course, that by the time the sermon comes to an end, there will be questions you will still have. There will still be parts that didn't get addressed and so on, but that's kind of the hazard of the territory. So having said that, what I want to talk about today is thinking about our thinking about sin. Thinking about our sinful nature in particular, or our flesh, as the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible says. Also, this notion of original sin. I think our thinking needs to change on these things. Now, where all of this comes about, first of all, begins with what we see in the pages of Scripture. The idea of original sin, the idea of where sin came from, is recorded in Genesis chapter 3, a chapter usually referred to as the fall. Adam and Eve are in the garden. God says, don't eat any fruit from that tree. They say, we're going to eat it anyway, and so they do. So they disobey God. They rebel against God's command. As a result of doing that, sin has come into the world, and now death arrives, and every human being after that has inherited this propensity to do sinful things. Some people think that even the guilt of Adam's sin is passed on to us as well. And there's certainly debate about that. But that's the basic idea, that we have a tendency to do wrong things because of what happened with Adam and Eve. And at a foundational level, the wrong things that we do, the things that we would call sin, are rebellion against God from the start. So as a result, then, we often read in our liturgies and in other books and so on that we have a wickedness at our core, that we have an evil root that must be expunged, that we must be saved from, and that from the start, we begin life in a state of needing forgiveness and grace and restoration, because left without that, we would ultimately face consequences for this root of rebellion within us. We see this in the scriptures cover to cover. We saw this in our psalm today when we read and chanted Psalm 51. What's happening in this psalm is King David had gotten caught by the prophet Nathan because he had committed adultery with a woman named Bathsheba. Really, he raped her, actually, and arranged for her husband to be killed off so he could marry her instead. And when he was called on the carpet, he repented. And he acknowledged his sin. And this psalm says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness. Wash me through and through from my wickedness and cleanse me from my sin." And then he goes on to say in verse 4, "Against you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." Which is a curious thing to say, because it would seem to me that Bathsheba probably wasn't all that happy with what had happened to her and to her husband. But David says, "Against you only have I sinned." And then he says in verse 6, "Indeed, I have been wicked from my birth, a sinner from my mother's womb." In the NRSV, it says that he was a sinner from conception. Now, if we grant that David might be using a little bit of hyperbole here, exaggerating to make a point a little bit, nevertheless, because those words are there, it has been taken to be thus and so, that what happened with David happens with us. As he was wicked from his birth, a sinner from the time he was conceived, so also we share that same status. And so this gives rise to this ongoing thought about original sin. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 7, in this famous tug-of-war passage, acknowledges further the challenge about this. He says, this is such a difficult thing. I want to do the right thing, but I can't do it. The things I hate are the things that I do. The things I love are the things I don't do. And he goes on to say, what a wretched man I am. And he could be saying that he is wretched because the situation itself is such a difficult thing to deal with. But chances are good he's also implying that at root he is a wretched man because of this inherited nature of sin. He will go on to say and try to, I'm not going to say he tries to, get away with things or anything, but he says, look, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. And so he personifies sin and gives sin agency to say that, look, I'm trying to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so anything that is contrary to that really isn't me. It's the sin living in me that's making me do that. And so he's trying to make a distinction with what's going on, but he's nevertheless acknowledging this propensity to do the wrong thing. He started earlier saying, look, before I knew anything from the law, before I heard anything about the Torah, I was just living in ignorance. Everything was fine. But then the law told me, hey, do not covet. Oh, so coveting is bad. And now suddenly I want to covet all the time. And this is bad. And if the law says don't do it and I do it anyway, well, then I'm rebelling and I'm being disobedient and I'm displeasing God. And now this is a really frustrating thing. And so he ends this passage that you heard this morning with this. So then, with my mind, I am a slave to the law of God, but with my flesh, I am a slave to the law of sin. And he communicates this sense of hopelessness and shame and concern that he cannot be who he wants to be. And this contributes to our understanding of our sinful nature, of our flesh, of this idea of original sin. But what is really going on here? Is this really so? Have we inherited a sin nature from Adam? Those of you that have heard me preach before have heard me suggest that the first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis are mythological and not actual history. So if there really wasn't an Adam and Eve to sin in the first place to pass it on, then what is going on? Well, once again, we have to remember that the Bible was written 2,000 to 3,000 years ago over the course of millennium, and it was written with the perspective and the knowledge that the authors had at the time. And so based on that knowledge, in a world when the gods are responsible for throwing lightning bolts down to the ground, when the earth is flat, when we've got the earth at the center of everything and it doesn't move, when you've got that kind of thinking going on, naturally there is a limit to your understanding of what's happening. You're going to describe things based on how it feels, how it seems, and if you have these laws given to you to say, do it this way, and then you seem to have a really difficult time doing it that way and you do something else, well, what else could it be but obedience or disobedience and rebellion and choosing to do it my way instead of God's way? Part of the reason why we've started this series on saying we should think some things through again and think about what in our religious thinking might need to change is because we've learned a lot of stuff over the past 2,000 years. In fact, over the last few hundred years, even through the last 50 years. And what I want to suggest to you today is stuff that we have learned about our brains within the last 50 years makes a difference in how we view what is being described as original sin in the Bible, what is being called our sinful nature. So here's the scenario. Homo sapiens have been around for about 200,000 years. It was at that point that the brain capacity that we have and our body shape emerged in the evolutionary process. And ever since then, Homo sapiens have been living on this planet. The important thing for us to understand is who we are today physically as human beings, as Homo sapiens, are really the same as it was 200,000 years ago. They back then are us today. We obviously have 200,000 years of knowledge that we have gathered and learned and built upon, and that's why how we live today looks so different from what it would have been back then. But we're basically talking about us. And part of what makes Homo sapiens important and distinct is the way that our brains have evolved. They've evolved in an additive way. In other words, you start with a foundational piece that is common to many living things, then another piece was added, and another piece was added, and another piece was added, which brings us to being called Homo sapiens, which means wise human or knowledgeable human. And it is the structure of our brains that I'm going to suggest to you that it affects how it is that we operate now. So let me run through a little bit of brain science for you. The oldest and most ancient part of our brain is what can be called our reptilian brain. It is shared by all sorts of living things. This reptilian brain is responsible for our physical instincts. It is what is responsible for our autonomous system. So, for example, you don't have to think about making your heart beat because the reptilian part of your brain makes that happen automagically. Right? You don't have to think about breathing because the reptilian part of your brain causes you to breathe. And on top of that, the reptilian part of our brain is responsible for our key survival instincts, sometimes known as the 3 S's: sustenance, security, and sex. Sometimes also known as the 5 F's: fight, flight, freeze, food, and copulation. So this part is what's responsible for those foundational pieces that are essential for our survival. If we did not have that part of our brain, Homo sapiens would not survive over the course of 200,000 years. The next part of our brain that evolved is our old mammalian brain. You can think of like furry little mammals running around with these things, and this is where we have our social instincts. This is where we have our understanding of kinship and being part of a tribe and a family. This is where our emotions reside. This is where our amygdala lives. This is a part of our body, part of our brain rather, that when it gets triggered because of intense pleasure or terror, it overrides everything. It's that part of the brain that makes it useless to tell somebody who's freaking out, hey, dude, just calm down. No, it doesn't work that way. The amygdala is an override, and it's hard to be in control because of that. Something deliberate has to be done to take over. But it is this part of our brain that is responsible for that connectedness with others, that sense of status, that sense of family, that whole idea of being an emotional being. Then the next part of the brain is our neocortex. This is the part of our brain that is responsible for our interpretive instincts. This is the part of the brain we use to figure things out, to try to analyze, to make plans. It is also the part of our brain with which we both fantasize and catastrophize. And so when you have a fantasy, you are imagining something, you have a scenario in your mind that is quite pleasurable, that isn't happening for real, and yet it creates a physiological response in your body. Similarly, when we catastrophize, we imagine a scenario in our minds that is not actually happening, but we can make it be so real that we are filled with anxiety about a thing that has never actually happened. It is this part of the brain that allows us then to start imagining what might the future look and what do I have to do to accomplish a goal or what have you. Well, the last part of our brain is the prefrontal cortex. It is the part of our brain that is responsible for our higher purpose, for our rational thought. It is the part that enables us to develop the concepts of how it is we can use things for our benefit. And it is also where our spirituality resides. It is with our prefrontal cortex that we do spiritual disciplines. And it is there that we also have the highest understanding of morality and ethics and the understanding that there is a way that we ought to live. Now, here's the problem. The oldest parts of our brain, that reptilian brain and that old mammalian brain, fire so rapidly that any signals coming from the prefrontal cortex are half as fast. We have the striking urge to act on one of those three key instincts of sustenance, security, and sex, often before we have a thought about whether we should. That's just the way the brain works. And that is necessary for survival, because if you encounter a grizzly bear and you're thinking, that's a grizzly bear, I'm wondering if that could be dangerous. Perhaps maybe I should, start engaging my feet and run or something. You're going to die. That's the way it goes, right? And whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, except bears. Bears will kill you, right? And so our old parts of our brain get that right away, and they cause us to act. The rational part of our brain is slower on the uptake. So when it comes to this notion of original sin in this ancient description, our sinful nature, to use the terms that Paul used in the NIV, or the flesh in the NRSV, he is using his limited understanding to try to describe why it is that he has a propensity to act according to these really strong urges that are contrary to this law that he has been given that he's supposed to follow. And the tug of war he has is, I'm trying to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, but I can't help but do this thing that is opposed to that law that has been given. What a wretched man I am. And the key thing that you get out of that is guilt. And the sense that you are indeed wicked through and through. As David said, wicked from my mother's womb. That in me is no good thing. And even though I say I love God, I still rebel against him. That's how he sees it. But if we understand that this is what's going on with our brains, then we can understand that, wait a minute, there's something else happening. There is something else happening that is very natural, but not inherently sinful. Because for 90% of the existence of Homo sapiens, this was absolutely how we had to operate in order to survive, to reproduce, for the species to continue to live. It's just that now, these instincts are mismatched for how we're living today with the civilization of humanity that has developed over the past 20,000 years. We have these mismatched instincts. The instincts that were appropriate for our ancestors for the majority of our history are no longer appropriate to live by in our civilized societies today. And so with those mismatched instincts, no wonder we're doing things that are contrary to what we ought to. Now, it's important to understand that moral codes and ethical behaviors and laws and stuff have been developing all around the world, around humanity, before Judaism started, before Christianity even started. The Egyptians had a moral code, an ethical way that you're supposed to live, before Jacob got there with his family. This is something that has emerged. We know there's a different way to live. But once you get into that compressed context of living as people plugged together, you now start creating an environment where these mismatched instincts are overrun by stimulus and allurements that they weren't designed to have to handle. Like, here's the thing. The moment we start having, property laws, this is mine and that is yours, well, now the impetus to perhaps steal something from somebody emerges. The moment we say, look, this is my wife and that's your wife, it creates the possibility of thinking, well, maybe I want that to be different. Now, different cultures will have different interpretations. One culture will say a man can have only one wife. Another culture will say that a man can have 6 wives. But both would agree that a man cannot have just whatever woman he wants, right? We start to see the development of these kinds of ethics. And yet, those base urges from our reptilian brains aren't equipped to make those distinctions. That's what the frontal lobe does. And so we're dealing with very natural things. And on top of that, we live in a world where we're surrounded by the stimulus for those base instincts all over the place. For example, physiologically, we are hardwired to crave sugar, salt, and fat. And the reason for that is because in the natural world, those things are hard to come by. They're relatively rare compared to other things. And so when you encounter a source of sugar, it's like, yes, let's get some of that because that'll give you the energy that you need. The fat will give you what you need to survive over the winter and all of this. And so you crave it because that's the design necessary for us to survive, for that S of survival. So let's just imagine this. You come across an orange tree or bush or whatever oranges grow on, and you see this orange. And you're going, oh man, that looks great. And you consume that orange and you're getting that fructose going. You got that sugar going. You're feeling excellent. And you're thinking, wow, let me have another one of those. And so you grab a second orange and you eat that and you're consuming this sugar, which is excellent. But then getting to the third orange, maybe you're starting to get a little full now and there just isn't quite enough room. And so there's this natural limit to how much sugar you take in. But nowadays, you can get a glass of orange juice with the equivalent amount of juice from 12 oranges in one glass. And you pound that back, and now you have way more fructose than your body knows what to do with. And when we live in a world where everything has sugar in it, next thing you know, the natural craving for sugar leads to an addiction to sugar. And an overuse of sugar leads to weight gain, joint pain, diabetes, all sorts of challenges. And yet our bodies are wired to crave sugar. This supernormal stimuli makes it challenging in today's day and age to be able to manage the naturally occurring appetites in our reptilian brain in order to not be overcome by the desire for these things. Add to that the plethora of opportunities for all sorts of sexual experiences around us, all sorts of different foods and drugs and alcohol. All these kinds of things are compressed, they're refined, they are more than would ever occur in the natural world, which just makes it that much harder for us to have our prefrontal lobe say, wait a minute, I shouldn't have a third piece of cake. And yet we go there anyway. The addictions that come from this are things that have been described in the past as demonic possession because of the control it exerts over people. But when it comes to dealing with addictions, one very helpful process is the 12-step group. And part of what we see mirrored in the 12-step group, which was founded by Christian men, admittedly for sure. But what would happen is if you go to a 12-step group, let's say you're going to Alcoholics Anonymous, you would come in and you would say, "Hi, my name is Derwyn, and I am an alcoholic." And what that does is it allows you to confess the reality of what's going on, but also it's removing the shame and the guilt for the challenge you are facing because your desire for sugars has been now made into an addiction through the sugars found in the fermentation process that produces alcohol. You are in a community of people who are sharing that experience with you and are wanting to support you through it, that you might learn the skills and habits necessary to overcome the supernormal stimuli that your mismatched instincts are dealing with. And as a result, many people find themselves able to overcome. The way that happens is you work through deliberate, conscious, rational thoughts using the frontal lobe in order to create neural pathways that become more efficient so that when the urge comes to have a drink, very quickly that front part of your brain gets there and says, "Wait a second, hold on, hold the phone. We can't be doing this." And this is part of what spiritual disciplines do. Prayer, meditation, silence, solitude, study, all these different parts that are part of the Christian practice and part of the practice of other religions have the effect of creating these neural pathways that enable us to live in accordance with the code that we know we should, and to allow ourselves not to be mastered by our instincts, but to master the instincts instead. And seeing it that way, I hope you can see, eliminates the need to feel constantly guilty, or that you are inherently wicked, or that you are somebody who just plain sucks because you can't live the right way. How is that a great place to start? Maybe what we should do is be able to practice something like this. "Hi, my name is Derwyn, and I'm a human being with mismatched instincts surrounded by supernormal stimuli. This is what's going on, and you all are exactly the same way as I am. It is a shared experience. It is something we all struggle with. And thanks be to God, there is a solution. Jesus is saying, here's the way we ought to live. Here is the way that we ought to conduct ourselves. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." And in the gospel passage today, he said, look, understand that it is what comes out of somebody that makes them defiled, that makes them impure. And then he lists a whole bunch of things that I would suggest to you can all be traced back to the root of those three instincts of survival, security, sustenance, and sex. And so we need to master those things. But we can approach them without beginning with the idea that we are inherently wicked and evil from birth. They had no idea how the brain worked when that was written down 2,000 years ago. But in the last 50 years, we've come to learn this is what's going on. And people have found freedom from addictions, and have found a way to have peace, even in non-religious methods. Let me suggest how much more then, if we give ourselves over to the teaching of Jesus, that we find ourselves that much more ready to live into how it is we ought to be. But we can do so without the feelings of guilt. Now let me say one last thing. I am not suggesting that that means you get off the hook. Right? It is not acceptable for someone to say, well, the devil made me do it, so it's not my fault. And so we also cannot say, well, my reptilian brain made me do it, so that gets me off the hook. No. It is still our responsibility to live rightly, to walk in the ways that would please God. The key is coming to understand that there is very much a mechanism that is naturally occurring, and that is responsible for our survival as a species in the first place, that we are now learning to work with in a new environment that our ancestors never had to live in before. So, with that, let us let our times of confession be simply acknowledging the reality of what we're dealing with. Let us let our asking for mercy and forgiveness not be something done in a groveling fashion, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, but instead to say, Lord, I need your help because these instincts are so strong and I want to live rightly. And we can find the help that we need in the times of need. And that, I think, is good news. Amen.